Okay, well, I think we're going to get started. I want to welcome everybody here. My name is Deborah Jonason-Young. I'm the director of the Stu Clark Center for Entrepreneurship at the University of Manitoba, Asper School of Business, and together with Dr. Suzanne Gagnon, we would like to express our sincere thanks for joining us today. As we commence our time together, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba is located on Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, Lakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these lands, recognize the harms and injustices that have occurred here, and continue to the present. And we dedicate ourselves to committed action towards reconciliation and collaboration with Indigenous peoples for change in the present and tomorrow. Our agenda today includes a brief introduction to the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub by Suzanne Gagnon, a few words of welcome by Dana Spiring, who will also introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Wendy Tsukier. Presentation, of course, on the state of women's entrepreneurship in Canada 2021. There will be time for Q&A. Please, during the course of the presentation, if you want to put your questions into the chat room, we'd be happy to review, and we'll do Q&A at the end of the presentation. We will close off our session at or before 1:15 as promised. So I'd now like to turn it over to Dr. Suzanne Gagnon, Associate Dean, Professional Graduate Programs and Executive Education at the University of Manitoba, Canada Life Chair in Leadership Education, and the Director of the James W. Burns Institute. Over to you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you very much. Welcome to everyone. It's really wonderful to see all of you here. Several people that we've been working with through the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, regional hub here at the Asper School in Manitoba. So a big welcome to everyone. For those of you who don't know, the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub shares research and resources on women entrepreneurs in Canada. It's a national network made up of 10 regional hubs. It operates in both official languages and includes an additional network of over 250 organizations. Several of them right here in Manitoba. WEKH, as we call it, is part of the Government of Canada's Women Entrepreneurship Strategy that was announced in 2019. And as I say, we're proud to be one of the regional hubs who support this work, building a community of practice and really conducting research and sharing knowledge to inform decision-making and policy change to reduce barriers to women and diverse women in their entrepreneurship aspirations. We're also proud that here at the Asper School, University of Manitoba, we have the National Indigenous Hub for the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, led by Ashley Richard and her team. So again, a big welcome to everyone. I see that we have Darren Fast here, the Director of Innovation at the University of Manitoba. We also have Digvir Jayas, one of our Vice Provosts. A big welcome to you and to everyone else. Back to you, Deborah.
Thanks, Suzanne. Okay, I would like to thank Dana Spiring for joining us today to provide our official welcome and introduce our guest speaker. Dana, of course, is the CEO of Economic Development Winnipeg, which is the lead economic development agency for Winnipeg, encompassing economic development Winnipeg, Yes Winnipeg, and Tourism Winnipeg. She provides leadership and strategic direction with key stakeholders and is a driving force behind making Winnipeg a compelling choice for business and tourism. Many of you would have known Dana before as former Chief Strategy Officer and General Counsel of the Canadian Wheat Board. And in addition to her 10-year career at the Wheat Board, she was also an associate for 5 years at Aikens, Macaulay and Thorvaldson. Dana sits on the board of the directors for WinPAC and previously served on the Manitoba Hydro Board. She is currently the chair of the Winnipeg Football Club's board of directors and is only the second woman to serve on the Canadian Football League's board of governors. Well known throughout Manitoba, Dana is a passionate Winnipegger and an exceptional contributor to the Winnipeg and Manitoba landscape. Dana, over to you.
Deborah, that introduction makes me feel old. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so thrilled to be here. And I think, this is going to be a great event and it's a very timely topic. And I am really, truly honored to be able to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Wendy Tsukier. Wendy is leading innovation and diversity expert, and she's the author of the best-selling book, Innovation Nation, and founder of Ryerson University's Diversity Institute. It should come as no surprise to anyone why the Globe and Mail, La Presse, and CTV once named her one of the top 25 transformational Canadians. That is an incredible honor. She has been at the forefront of sounding the alarm about the impact that the pandemic has had on women, work, and our economy, and how the only way that we will bounce back is to have a she recovery. In economic development, we often talk about the multiplier effect. If you can create one job, how many more jobs will develop as a result? If women were better supported and we help them to build their businesses, imagine how many more jobs we would create. You don't have to imagine. Wendy is on it. She has said a 10% increase in women-led small or medium-sized business could add 1.98 billion to Canada's GDP. As a woman in economic development, it's a number that I'm interested in hearing more about, how we get there, and the role women entrepreneurship is playing in an ever-shifting economic landscape. I know you are all anxious to hear more as well from Wendy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wendy Tsukier to the stage. Wendy, over to you.
Thanks so much. I am, however, am I on mute still?
No, you're good. We can hear you.
Okay, sorry. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to join you. And, like many academics, occupational hazard, I'm used to talking in 3-hour blocks and giving people tests. So I will count on my good friend Suzanne to help pace me if I'm going too slow, to make sure there's time for questions. I also wanted to start by saying that I am in Toronto. I'm on the unceded territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Wendat peoples. And I think perhaps I will preface this by saying, the discovery of the unmarked graves of children in Kamloops had a really profound effect on me on a number of ways. But one of the most important ways was to realize that I had not been paying attention. I sent out a note to my staff, particularly the Indigenous staff, and said, what should we do? Ryerson was going through a name change because there's a lot of controversy about the founder of the institution. And I sent out a note saying, I drafted something. I'm shocked and I'm appalled. And like many of you, I want to renew my commitment to truth and reconciliation. And the message that came back was, why are you shocked? Why are you appalled? Why didn't you know? And I say that just as it was a valid retort. And I say that because I think on issues of diversity and inclusion, at least in my experience, and I've been doing this for a really long time, it is a journey and we're constantly learning. and we're constantly refining our understanding of what the issues are and what the impacts are, and so on and so forth. So I come to the whole area of women's entrepreneurship after quite a long history working in the tech sector in Silicon Valley, teaching information technology and so on. It's been a real learning process for me, and I've been very fortunate to work with people like Deborah and Suzanne, and of course, Ashley and others who have really helped me personally understand better what some of the issues are that we need to grapple with. I'll also say that as a former Vice President of Research and Innovation, I'm acutely aware of how important some of these issues are, not just to universities, but to the entire ecosystem. So I'm hoping that the kind of work that we're doing could potentially shape practice, because really what the Diversity Institute's about and what the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub is about is not research for its own sake, but how we can use evidence and insight to transform what we do. So I'll give you a bit of just a quick run through on a number of issues that have surfaced over the last couple of years. We've been working specifically on issues around women entrepreneurship, and a lot of this is work that Suzanne has led or collaborated on. And I'm going to perhaps be a little bit provocative in some of the things that I say, because I think the way that we are approaching this issue is maybe a bit different than other organizations. So a lot of what we have done in terms of research is not what the academics on the call would consider research from the point of view of focusing on peer-reviewed journal articles. We do that, of course, but a lot of what we have been doing, and we call research, is actually the synthesis of information, from a variety of different sources in order to get insight. And so what I'm going to try to do is identify and really focus on what I think some of the insights were that the work that WEKH has been doing over the last few years, and how those insights could inform practice. So the first one, and this for me is in some ways one of the most important ones, is definitions. So if we think, and many government programs think this, if we think that a woman entrepreneur is a majority owner of a small, medium enterprise with employees, what we will find is about 16% of SMEs are majority owned by women. And that's in the neighborhood of 100,000 enterprises, give or take, across the country. On the other hand, if we think of entrepreneurship as also including self-employment, or sometimes, people refer to solopreneurs, for example, 37% of self-employed Canadians are women, and that's 1 million people. I view entrepreneurship, with the classic definition, as someone who creates something new. And I also believe that it doesn't necessarily just entail things that are created for profit. And so if we take a broad notion of what entrepreneurship is to include social as well as for-profit ventures, we end up with a very different insight. And that becomes very important, at least in my experience, when we're looking, for example, at Indigenous entrepreneurs. Because if you ask some Indigenous people if they want to be an entrepreneur and create apps and grow up to be like Steve Jobs, they will look at you blankly. But if you ask them if they want to create value for their community, it may resonate. And so the very notion of what an entrepreneur is or is not has profound impacts on how we design services, how we manage education, the kinds of supports we put in place, and most importantly, how we shape the aspirations of women and other diverse entrepreneurs. So, for me, that's one of the most important insights that's come out of this work. We also know that women are more likely to have smaller firms. They're more likely to be underfinanced. They're more likely not to have employees. And all of these structural differences have a real impact, because I would suggest many of the systems and the programs and the policies and the supports that are in place were designed based on the assumptions that an entrepreneur is a majority owner of an SME, probably in the tech sector, with employees, that aspires to grow, and that is the focus of many of the programs that currently exist. And so, I don't need to go through this in more detail, but we have a lot of data that shows this. Because a lot of women entrepreneurs don't incorporate, they're self-employed, they do not have access to all the same supports as other entrepreneurs who do incorporate. Because Indigenous entrepreneurs often live on reserve, where there are issues around ownership of property, taxes, and so on, a lot of them also choose not to incorporate. And when we look at Black entrepreneurs, which account for about 7% of the entrepreneurs in a city like Toronto, we see similar phenomena. So this issue of the definitions applies not just to women, but across different groups. And so one of the big areas that we are focusing on is trying to at least ensure that women entrepreneurs understand the pros and cons of incorporation, because it has profound impacts on what services they're eligible for. On the other hand, we're focusing on trying to get government agencies and others, banks and so on, to recognize that incorporation is not necessarily the only marker of an entrepreneur, and we have to consider our policies and practices. When the COVID relief programs were first rolled out, most women entrepreneurs could not apply because they were not incorporated, and then they modified the criteria. So a lot has been said about the issues around finance and lack of access to finance, the fact that women-led businesses tend to be smaller, the fact that they often do not have the same aspirations. Growth may not be their principal goal. Sustainable employment may be their principal goal. But what's interesting is when you start to dig down into particular segments of the women entrepreneurship space, what you will find is women actually excel in some areas. I mean, they're more likely to be in services. So when it comes to things like e-commerce and online marketplaces, or even things like crowdfunding, women actually bridge the gap. And the other thing that's happened in recent years is it used to be that men entrepreneurs exported more than women entrepreneurs. That difference is very narrow now. And in fact, Indigenous entrepreneurs are more likely to export than Canadian-born entrepreneurs. So some of the research that we've been doing is focused on things like scaling up and what are the factors that help women entrepreneurs scale up, because we know that in many sectors of government and many departments are preoccupied with scaling up, exporting, and so on, commercialization of IP and so forth. And so we did sponsor some research by the Brookfield Institute that looked at patterns of scaling up, what the factors were, and so on. And it reinforced a lot of what we already knew, which is that scaling up is often not, and growth is often not a priority. Sometimes this is a function of sector. So a lot of the models and the expectations around what entrepreneurs should and shouldn't do, including growth. Someone recently said that growth for its own sake is the ideology of a cancer cell, which I thought was quite on point. But growth for its own sake may not be the goal of an entrepreneur. A sustainable source of income for a small group of people, for a family, for a community, in my mind, can be just as legitimate. And, you know, it was interesting because when we think about multiplier effects, I come from a GM town, so spent a lot of my formative years listening to why we needed to save auto worker jobs because of the multiplier effects. We don't apply the same rationale to services sectors. Jim Stanford, who used to be with the auto workers, recently did an analysis, for example, that showed that the multiplier effects for childcare jobs are just as great as they are for auto workers. So we have to start rethinking some of our assumptions. We also know that there are differences in what brings men and women into the entrepreneurship space. And as I said before, we see that often, women often, more often, are necessity entrepreneurs. They're pushed as opposed to pulled. We see that for sure with newcomers and racialized entrepreneurs and often Indigenous entrepreneurs as well, that they are necessity entrepreneurs. They can't find employment or they need to supplement their income. And that's what takes them into business ownership. In spite of the fact that we see fewer women in the unicorn, or as we like to say, soonicorn space, meaning the businesses exceeding $1 billion, what's interesting is 14% of Canadian soonicorns, meaning they're above 600 million USD, are owned by women. So think about it. I told you earlier that 15.7% of majority of SMEs are majority owned by women. 14% of Canadian soonicorns have at least one woman co-founder. So if you look at different stages, women are slightly underrepresented in those high-end, high-growth businesses, but not entirely. So we're digging in more on that. And one of the things we want to do is sort of reverse engineer some of these success stories, because we know women face barriers, and I can talk more about those, but I won't go into a lot of detail because most of that research is well known. We know that women face barriers. We know Indigenous people face barriers. We know that Black entrepreneurs face barriers, and so on. But if we reverse engineer the success stories, the people who have succeeded in spite of the fact that they face those barriers, in spite of the fact that, you know, as was, I think it was former governor of Texas who said Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did backwards and in high heels. You know, if you think about the women soonicorns as backwards and in high heels, meaning that they had to work probably twice as hard to get where they were because of the barriers, that provides some really interesting opportunities to figure out what the things were that distinguished them, how they overcame the barriers or went around them or knocked them down in order to become successful. And then we can play that back through the ecosystem. One of the things we know that about COVID, as was mentioned at the outset, is that it had a profound impact on women generally in the workplace, but really on women entrepreneurs. And if you add other dimensions of identity, if you look at Black entrepreneurs, if you look at racialized entrepreneurs, Indigenous entrepreneurs, and so on, everything is worse. And partly that's a function of sector, right? Think about it. What sector did best during COVID? Why did Shopify become Canada's largest company during COVID? Because tech was accelerated in many ways because people were moving to online platforms. Tech is a sector where women are underrepresented, Black entrepreneurs are underrepresented. Indigenous entrepreneurs are underrepresented. Then think of the sectors hardest hit by COVID: accommodation, services, and so on. Those are the places you're more likely to find women and other diverse entrepreneurs. So it's structural to a large extent. On top of that, of course, was the crushing burden of unpaid work. And I'm not sure, I remember that Suzanne was able to get her hair cut when I couldn't. So I think that the way in which COVID affected your province and this province was maybe a bit different. But in this province, they closed the schools basically and shifted everything to online learning. They closed the daycare. So suddenly you had women entrepreneurs trying to juggle their more than full-time enterprise, often with childcare, home care, unpaid labor, and so on. And that led to about 30% of women considering leaving the workplace. And that also led, I think, to the good fortune that we have in childcare suddenly becoming a much more central issue when we talk about recovery. And one of my proudest moments was when the head of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, Rocco Rossi, stood up and said, childcare is not a women's issue. Childcare is an economic issue. And when you see Jim Stanford talking about the multiplier effects of childcare jobs, that just reinforces how we can shift our thinking about some of these issues. The other thing that we saw COVID do, as it reinforced the dependence on technology and accelerated digitization, is it also exacerbated the digital divide. And I believe that Manitoba is not a lot different than this province, although it might be flatter, and maybe that makes a difference. But we have huge disparities in terms of access to high-speed internet. You can go an hour and a half outside of Toronto and not be able to get the high-speed internet because of the Canadian Shield. And certainly we know that half of the Indigenous population that lives on reserve doesn't have access to internet. I mean, a lot of them don't have access to water, and internet is harder to get than water. So we have huge issues of access to the technology, the infrastructure to support businesses as they're digitizing. And even in Toronto we learned 42% of racialized people did not have access to high-speed internet or thought high-speed internet was too expensive. 42% of racialized kids were doing their homework on smartphones because they didn't have devices, they couldn't afford high-speed internet, and so on. Just think about the profound impacts that has on inequality. So if you're a poor woman, a racialized woman, an Indigenous woman trying to run, start, operate a business, and you're trying to support your kids, take all that together, and it really created a very difficult situation. And you can see here that as I said, the sectors where women dominate, we have were sectors that were most impacted by COVID: accommodation, retail, and healthcare. We also know that COVID impacted sales and revenues and jobs for women more than men. We know that women-led businesses that had staff were more likely to have laid them off. And those things, as I said, are amplified for many people when we take an intersectional lens. So the Black Business Professional Association, for instance, did a study of Black entrepreneurs, compared them to the Canadian Federation of Independent Business Members. And what it showed was, on every single measure, Black entrepreneurs were harder hit than the average member of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business in terms of layoffs, sales loss, likelihood of closing. And they were half as likely to be able to benefit from any of the programs that were available. They were half as likely to be able to take on additional debt. So again, when we think about impact of COVID, we have to think about not only the impact it had on the businesses, but the availability of those supports, which were unevenly distributed. Indigenous women are more entrepreneurial than other women in Canada. This was a study that we did with the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business. As I mentioned, more likely to look at community impacts and social impacts than simply making lots of money, more likely to export, and of course, more challenges in terms of access to financing and infrastructure. And, you know, Ashley Richard did a lot of consultations with more than 40 Indigenous organizations to get insights into the experience of Indigenous women entrepreneurs. And there were a lot of issues that emerged in those consultations that have to do with the structure of legislation and the Indian Act and so on. And as I said before, access to infrastructure. We also did some work looking at women entrepreneurs living with disabilities. And it's interesting because this is a case where we see there's a bit of a double-edged sword. Entrepreneurship is actually, in some ways, a lifestyle and economic livelihood choice that can suit people with disabilities who may need more flexibility than normal workplaces afford. Better to work for themselves than to work for other people. And in fact, there's a headline I think I have at the end of the presentation from Forbes that says ADHD, the entrepreneur's superpower, because we know there's lots of evidence to support the notion that people with cognitive differences who may not fit in to hierarchical structures, traditional organizations, and so on, excel in entrepreneurship. And that was one of the big findings with the book that I did, Innovation Nation. But again, you have these other issues like access to internet supports and so on that also are barriers. Rural entrepreneurs, we're looking, you know, what is a farmer? A farmer is an entrepreneur. And in fact, one of the strongest predictors that someone will be an entrepreneur is that one of their parents were entrepreneurs. And when we look at that, farmers give rise to many, many successful entrepreneurs because their kids grow up knowing the importance of hard work, knowing the vicissitudes of, you know, weather and other factors you can't control. So having to live with risk, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So often we don't think of people in agribusiness as entrepreneurs, but they most certainly are among the earliest entrepreneurs that we've had. And in agriculture, you see that women often are disproportionately represented in the sense that they are often underrepresented as majority owners, but very often equal owners because it's a family farm. And so we're working on those issues. The other thing that we think is really important is impact and looking at investments. And Suzanne mentioned that the federal government has committed over $5 billion to the Women Entrepreneurship Strategy in order to dramatically increase the number of women entrepreneurs and drive the economic development and social inclusion that we talked about. But in order to figure out what works and what doesn't work, we need formal evaluation. And so we've put a lot of effort into trying to think about how we can evaluate the impact of entrepreneurship, the impact specifically of women entrepreneurs, and what works. There's a lot of money going into programs and loans and training and so on and so forth, but what actually produces results? And so, you know, one of the things that for me is always irksome, as I said, even though my background's technology, I was a vice president of research and innovation, is the fact that we think about technology investments as basically not requiring a lot of scrutiny. So you'll see cases where, you know, government will write a check for $50 million to the latest quantum computing startup, which has a 90% chance of failing, but if it pays off big. And so what we started to do is really try to say, okay, you want to give $5 million to this tech company. What would happen if you gave that $5 million instead in smaller parcels to women, women-led businesses or Indigenous businesses or Black businesses? And what we're finding is that not only do they very often outperform on traditional innovation metrics, whether we're talking about job creation, they may not be creating, jobs for machine learning, AI specialists, but they're creating jobs for people who support their families and purchase things and have a multiplier effect. They may not be growing at the same rate as the tech companies. They may not be exporting at the same rates, but women entrepreneurs actually perform really well on those traditional economic measures, dollar for dollar. And I probably won't have time to talk about it, but I think it's important to think about. At the same time, they outperform others on measures that typically are not included. And there I would talk about, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. There I would talk about increasingly we're looking at ESGs for boards and so on. There I would talk about building human capital and communities and so on. Those are often things we don't try to measure when we're looking at the impact of investments in entrepreneurs. But I would argue, if you're interested in the future of Canada, those are equally important things to the number of jobs that are created. And so when we look at things like SheEO, which is a program that basically crowdsources funding for women entrepreneurs in $50,000 blocks, and we look at the impact that they have, I think $5 million in loans had a 100% payback rate, 300% almost average venture growth as a result of those investments, and produced over 200 jobs and was diverse. So large percentage of Indigenous founders, racialized founders, and so on. So you can look at both the economic impacts and the social impacts. And in my view, if you do that systematically, you will see that the return on investment for women entrepreneurs often is much better than for others. And perfect example for me was the other day, my province announced $5 million investment in women entrepreneurs, Black entrepreneurs, and Indigenous entrepreneurs. At the same time, they announced a $24 million investment in the Perimeter Institute, which is a sort of think tank focused on quantum computing and stuff. That investment, really important, but the proportionality is often not there when we think about women entrepreneurs. Similarly, we've done studies for the Women Enterprise Center in BC, for Femisur in Quebec, and so on. Very similar patterns. Dollar for dollar, you get more bang for your buck when you invest in women entrepreneurs, and you advance gender equality, social inclusion, lots of other stuff. So I know I'm running out of time, even though Suzanne has not brought out the hook, but I wanted to say just a few more things before we go to questions. And that is that the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub does not just focus on supporting organizations dedicated to women. That's important, and we are trying to strengthen those networks. But I think the hardest work that we're doing, and yet the most important work, is trying to build inclusion into the entire ecosystem. And by that, I mean thinking about instead of telling banks that they need to set aside a few $1,000,000 for women entrepreneurs, or instead of telling incubators and accelerators that should have special programs for the girls, making sure that we look at their policies and their processes to erode the bias and the barriers that exist. Because frankly, there's way more money there's way more money in those mainstream programs around economic development, innovation, research, and so on, than there is in the programs that are labeled for women. And we are 51% of the population. So that's sort of in a nutshell, our raison d'etre is thinking about the pieces of the ecosystem, thinking about what are the criteria that banks are using for deciding who to finance and the terms to give. Well, the 5 C's are mostly based on historic data, and that historic data is mostly men in manufacturing and technology. So of course, when you apply those criteria to women in services with smaller businesses, they're not going to fare as well. And so we have to really start to unpack some of those systemic issues. And one of them is this notion that, you know, often we equate innovation with technology. And of course, technology is a driver of innovation, but it's not the only form of innovation. Processes, services, products, those are also equally important when it comes to innovation. And if you start to challenge some of these assumptions, you'll find more women, more Indigenous people, and more Black people. I mean, I think about agriculture. A lot of farmers are not filing patents, some are, but a lot of farmers aren't registering IP, but they're the heaviest users of the Internet of Things because they use technology in innovative ways. And similarly, you know, Kylie Jenner was a billionaire at the age of 20, not because she she created some new app, but because she used Shopify to sell stuff. So you can actually use technology to grow without being in technology, as it were. And again, you know, some of the interesting areas of innovation have nothing whatsoever to do with technology. So if you break that stereotype, innovation is technology, and you start to think about other forms of innovation, you make space for entrepreneurs. And similarly, you know, if you do a Google image search on entrepreneur, you get men in tech, men in tech. And we're working really hard to challenge those assumptions, to look at successful women entrepreneurs. Celine Dion is one of the richest women in Canada. Celine Dion's company is worth $600 million. Most people don't think of people, especially not women in the arts, as entrepreneurs, but they most certainly are. And the See It, Be It campaign really focused on profiles of award-winning entrepreneurs from across the country. And we hit 1,000 for International Women's Day last year, and we hope to double it by International Women's Day this year. But again, we're thinking about women entrepreneurs across sectors. As I said, you know, to create a more inclusive innovation ecosystem, we have to apply a gender and diversity lens across the dimensions of the ecosystem. And I won't go through this in detail. People are really interested in digging in on this more. Happy to share the slides and other stuff. And Joelle Foster, who runs North Forge there, is part of a network called the Incubate Innovate Network of Canada. And we're actually working with them to try to really drive leading edge practices around diversity and inclusion, right at the level of incubators and accelerators, to open up the doors for more women and diverse people. Procurement, one of the single most important levers for creating an inclusive innovation ecosystem. Because in spite of all the attention, and I think the financing is really important, the best way to finance your business is by having revenue, right? And so access to markets and customers can really be facilitated, especially by large organizations and governments, if they take a gender and diversity lens to their procurement practices. And there's we have a woman from the federal government on secondment for a couple of years who's working with us specifically on this, because it's not enough to say we're dedicating 5% of our spend to Indigenous people or to women. You have to also make sure that they have the capacity to participate. And a lot of public sector processes require at least 3 PhDs to succeed at, because there's so much paperwork. I mean, and Suzanne can verify this, to file our application for WEKH, which was a competitive process. We had to get the incorporation documents for the University of Manitoba, which were buried in some archive somewhere, you know, and of course, WEKH was a big project, but often government processes will require levels of documentation for $100,000 project, just as they would for an $8.6 million project. So procurement is two-sided. You need customers to make commitments. We're working with Starbucks, for example, which has commitments around shelf space for diverse entrepreneurs, but you also have to make sure that the entrepreneurs have the capacity to navigate those systems. And sometimes you can work with tier 1 suppliers to make that happen. We dig in deep on organizational practices. Rather than thinking about diversity and inclusion as an HR issue, we think about it as something that needs to be embedded in strategy, needs to be embedded in the value chain, needs to be built into how you think about the design of products and services and marketing and everything else. We think what gets measured gets done. And so, you know, you need metrics. So businesses set metrics for everything else. You have to set metrics around the diversity and inclusion issues. And then thinking about partnerships in the ecosystem. You know, as I said, capacity building is an issue for many women-led businesses and Indigenous businesses and Black-led businesses. So you need to always be thinking about both supply and demand. Suzanne already mentioned the work that Ashley has been doing on our behalf. And we were very proud to have a pipe ceremony where we were given a traditional name by Elder Margaret Lavalley of the Sag King First Nation. So her authentic engagement with Indigenous organizations has produced a number of reports that I think have really transformational insights, and I'd encourage you to have a look at those. We also are really focused, as I said, on capacity building issues. And I think one of the things that I believe that we had a big impact on was ensuring that the federal government and the Future Skills Center recognize that banks and large corporations, very important drivers of the economy. However, they account for between 10 and 15% of employment. You know, 85% of employment in Canada is in small and medium enterprises. So any strategy that you have around skills development, for example, that is based on large corporations telling you what they need, is ignoring the vast majority of employers in the country. And so we were very successful, both I think in terms of the budget commitments, but also some of the programs that the Future Skills Center has now agreed to support, which are focused very precisely on building skills and capacity among entrepreneurs. And we have projects that are focused on women in tech and Black entrepreneurs and others, but very, very precise focus on skills development. And we do a lot of training. It's not our raison d'etre. Our raison d'etre is we're more the B2B play, but it's just happened that with COVID, we were asked to do a lot more programming and provide a lot more support. And we know this is critical because when you survey women, they're less likely to go to incubators or accelerators and more likely to want counseling, training, coaching, and support. And so the skills agenda for us, hugely important and one we're going to continue to press forward on. So, you know, we have lots of research. We're always looking for partners. We want to make sure the stuff we do is actually useful in terms of driving change, both at the policy level, but supporting organizations that are on the ground supporting women entrepreneurs. So I'll stop with this and just say thank you so much for your time, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Thank you very much. Please nod if you can hear me. I think my mic is on. Yes, beautiful. Thank you. Very rich presentation, and we're very happy to take questions. You could either raise your hand or put the question into chat. I'm happy with both of those processes. Let me say, while you might think about your questions, I want to recognize a few other people who have joined us. We're really pleased they're here. So Evelyn Jacks and Elba Haid were our two women entrepreneurs from Manitoba who we highlighted in the very first stage of the See It, Be It campaign. Evelyn, of course, is the very prolific author and founder of the Knowledge Bureau, and Elba, the president and CEO of WEKH. So I'm sure many of the things that Wendy spoke about, they are unicorns in their own right in these sectors, which are not the sectors that are usually talked about in terms of unicorns. So big welcome to Evelyn and Elba. Also to MJ, my Brownscombe, CEO of She Analytics. Thanks for being here. And Joelle Foster is here. So thank you, Joelle, for being here as well. And finally, Allison Kirkland, who is the CEO of the Women Enterprise Organizations of Canada. Her organization coordinates overusing the word organization, but the women enterprise centers and affiliated organizations around the country. So nice to see you too, Allison. Questions? Anybody want to please raise it? Oh, Dana, thank you so much. Over to you.
Thanks. Wendy, thanks so much for the presentation. It was really informative. You know, one of the things that twigged for me when you were presenting was the importance of procurement and the importance of ensuring that women businesses have revenue. Can you dig into that a little bit more? I'm wondering, one, how we help to create that environment where we can better support women to get procurement. And are there things that, you know, that we need to be mindful of, or you know, specific things that maybe women-led businesses need to do differently or need to understand as they go down this path?
Well, thank you very much for the questions. So there are a number of organizations in Canada that are far more expert in this stuff than I am, but I'll, you know, WeConnect and WeBe and so on. And even, you know, groups like the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business, which are primarily focused on Indigenous entrepreneurs, but also take an intersectional approach, and there are others. So, you know, they could talk more about the things that they're doing. But my perspective is, as I said, it's both a supply and demand thing. My view is companies that say, and organizations that say they're committed to diversity and inclusion need to do more than, you know, wave pride parades and flags on Pride Day and have events on International Women's Day. They need to put their money where their mouth is. So I think that's the first thing. And there are organizations like CAMSI and others that are really pushing large corporations in particular to step up in this regard. The States is ahead of us when it comes to set-asides and procurement and commitments, but there are large corporations that are with the program. And I mentioned, you know, we're doing work with Starbucks, and frankly, it's pretty impressive. I mean, in the States, Walmart had a track record on that. So that's important. Government, you know, government in Canada is a big piece of the economy. And while it may be true that the big plays in government typically are the, you know, multi-million-dollar infrastructure kinds of programs, often in sectors where you don't have tons of women, there's lots of procurement in services, you know, consulting, public relations, IT services, even training, and so on and so forth. And if there's, you know, often people will say, well, you know, our bids are open to everybody. No women applied, no Indigenous people applied. There were no Black people. You know, I'm married to a woman. I love women. Women are great, but none are there. You have to be far more intentional in terms of building capacity. So it's not enough to send someone an RFP. You have to work on getting them ready to respond to the RFP. And so really progressive organizations and governments, in my view, are thinking about it more as a pathway and less of a, well, we dedicated 5% of our spend and we sent the RFP and none of them responded. We're done. You know, if you're really committed to this, you have to think about what are the barriers? Like, is it unnecessarily complex? Are you putting in requirements for $100,000 tender that are vestiges of your $3 billion tender? And so there's a disconnect between your risk and your processes. Are you requiring someone to have a PhD to work through the 50 pages in the RFP? And we know that for Indigenous peoples and certainly the Black community, often the literacy levels can be a huge barrier. That, like, you can use plain language. You can have two-stage processes where you get people to qualify and then you work with them. So there's quite a lot of stuff, I would argue, that can be done on the buyer side to open up opportunities. We replied to a quote to do a community consultation for the city of Calgary. And I was blown away by the rigor of their diversity requirements. They didn't have a lot of bureaucratic extra stuff in terms of, you know, incorporation documents and things like that. But they asked a lot of questions about your leadership, your composition, whether you were creating opportunities for diverse youth. And it really gave me pause because we were able to check a lot of the boxes. But I thought, you know, if you start to get people with lots of money doing that, that changes behavior faster than anything else. And then there's work that we need to do on the other side to make sure that women know about MERCs and the various places you can go for government bids, that they understand that just because it's a 50-page RFP doesn't mean it's actually that complicated, because probably there are only 2 pages that really matter. And so there's a lot of coaching and training and support that we can do to help get women ready. But a lot of it is, it seems to me, thinking about it, recognizing the differences between those $3 billion bids. And even with those, you know, some governments and purchasers are starting to say, okay, you're a tier 1 provider, you're IBM, you're who, you know, whatever. We want to see how you're subcontracting to diverse businesses, because even in those big mega projects, often there's a piece of work that has to do with communications or implementation or project management consultants or other things that can create opportunities. I don't know, you know, that's, if that answers your question, but I think it's being intentional.
Yeah, that makes lots of sense. I don't think there is an easy answer, but those are good points for us to consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Wendy. I see Susan Bader. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks so much. I was interested in some of your research about the impacts in COVID. And one of the things that we're noticing is an increased need for supports around mental health for women entrepreneurs. And I just wondered if you could talk and see if your research has been similar.
100%. And remember, like, we're doing research through Future Skills as well. So we've published, in fact, there was, I don't know if it made the Winnipeg Free Press, but there was an article on a thing we recently did on COVID and the differentiated impacts on different populations. And gender is a factor, age is a factor, and other dimensions of diversity are factors. It's interesting because we're just launching preliminary pilot project with Green Shields, which is providing free access to one of their new online mental health services specifically for women. And so they're giving us a bunch of free hours that we're going to test whether or not that makes a difference. We know that things like our Ask Give platform were really developed just to give people someone to talk to. And often it isn't a professional counselor or clinician that someone needs to talk to. They just need to talk to someone who can say, yeah, that's my experience too. We know one of the things that is not just a function of COVID, but it's a function of insights that are coming up as we deal with more Indigenous entrepreneurs and certainly Black entrepreneurs, is the impact of trauma, intergenerational trauma, anti-Black racism trauma, the trauma that comes from being a refugee, and so on and so forth, which means that in some ways it can create more grit and resilience and all kinds of things. And that's why we see refugees are often very successful entrepreneurs. But it also means that when you're developing programs, you need a trauma-informed lens. So, we do a program with the Black Business Professional Association called Boss Women, 13 weeks, 3 hours a week. I speak at it, usually once a term, 100 women each cohort. Third time through, there's a woman there who's done it 3 times. And I'm going like, it's the same information. And I asked, Nadine Spencer, what's that about? And she said, it's the community, it's the support. It's the realizing that you are not alone in this is the value for that particular program. It's much less about, how you figure out your addressable market, stuff like that. So I think mental health, our attention on mental health has become much more focused as a result of COVID, but I think it's very, very clear that it's an issue for women entrepreneurs, and especially diverse women entrepreneurs, regardless of COVID.
Thank you. Thank you for that question too. Yeah, very, very interesting. PK Much, I did see your question in the chat. I was just going to read the first one, but if you'd like to ask it yourself, please go ahead.
Okay, great. Hi, Wendy. I wasn't planning on asking a question, but I had to do this. So much great work has been done on understanding women's entrepreneurship, the barriers and how to overcome them. But one of the things I'm seeing a lot is exploitation of women entrepreneurs. And I'm wondering if there's a study or some way we can get a better understanding of that out there. So many women entrepreneurs get bargained down on price when they see their male counterparts get the ask. We've seen stories of women entrepreneurs being taking on a male COO only to have them go to the investors and say, pick me, let's get rid of her, because she was too, didn't have the life experience or the business experience to do what because of the lack of experience, they get taken advantage of. So exploitation in this space, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting because as much as I'm a fan of Jim Stanford, he's actually in principle opposed to promoting women entrepreneurship because for exactly that reason, because of the potential for exploitation. And in fact, I did an interview this morning on gig work, and the fact is gig work is growing. A lot of employers are outsourcing tasks they previously would have had employees working on. And there's definitely potential for exploitation when you're self-employed, when you are a survival entrepreneur, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a really good point. I'm not aware of, systematic work that's been done in that space, but it's a really good observation.
Okay, thank you.
Good question for further research. Thank you. We would have time for maybe one more question if someone would like to raise one. Anyone else? If not, I'm seeing very nice notes in the chat. Yes, I've also deeply appreciated this discussion and those comments. I will turn it back to Deborah to close us out and give also my personal thank you to both Wendy and Dana for making this possible. Over to you, Deborah.
Thank you, Suzanne. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending today and for partaking in this very important conversation. Thank you, Wendy, for continuing to elevate the conversation around diversity and in particular, the impact of women entrepreneurship, both on the economic and social fabric and well-being of our country. I think this has been a great conversation. Thank you also to Dana for joining us today and partaking in the conversation. Please continue to check out the great information that is constantly being renewed on the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub website. There are great pieces of information and white papers there that will help you gain a greater understanding towards this very important conversation. Thanks so much, everybody, for attending. May you have a great rest of the day, and we look forward to seeing you at a future session. Thank you.